The door slammed behind Victoria Morgan with such force that the entire porch shuddered, and she stood there in the gathering dusk of December 1878, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid Wyoming air, as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her like an avalanche. Her mother-in-law's final words still rang in her ears, cold and merciless as the wind that now whipped at her thin shawl. They had brought her all the way from her late husband's ranch to Fort Laramie, promising her shelter and family support after Thomas died 3 weeks ago from a fever that took him too quickly, but instead they had deposited her at what she thought was a boarding house only to discover it was abandoned, and now they were gone, their wagon already disappearing down the frozen road in the failing light. Victoria pressed her gloved hands to her face, fighting back tears that would only freeze on her cheeks. She was 23 years old, a widow of less than a month, and now abandoned by the very people who should have been her family. Thomas had been kind to her during their brief marriage of only 8 months, but his parents had never warmed to her, viewing her as an outsider from the moment Thomas brought her home from Denver, where she had been working as a seamstress. They blamed her for their son's death somehow, as though she had brought the fever into their home, though the doctor had assured everyone it was simply bad luck and the harsh conditions of the previous winter that had weakened Thomas's constitution. She turned to look at the building behind her, its windows dark, and several panes cracked or missing entirely. Snow had drifted onto the porch through gaps in the railing, and she could see through the front window that the interior was empty of furniture. This was no boarding house. This was a trap, a way for the Morgans to rid themselves of her without the guilt of leaving her on the side of the road. At least here they could claim they had brought her to town, to civilization, and what happened after was her own responsibility. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun sank below the horizon, and Victoria knew she had perhaps an hour before full darkness fell, and the cold became truly dangerous. She had exactly 47 cents in her reticule, the clothes on her back, and a small carpet bag with 2 dresses, undergarments, and the few personal items she had managed to keep after the Morgans went through Thomas's things. They had claimed nearly everything as family property, leaving her with almost nothing. Victoria descended the porch steps carefully, her boots crunching on the frozen ground as she looked up and down the street. Fort Laramie was not a large town, but it had grown considerably since the fort itself had been established, with businesses and homes spreading out from the military post. Lamplight glowed in windows along the main street, and she could hear the distant sound of a piano from what was likely a saloon. She needed to find help, and quickly. She walked toward the center of town, her carpet bag clutched in one hand and her shawl pulled tight with the other. The wind cut through her wool dress as though it were made of paper, and she could already feel the numbness beginning in her toes. Several people passed her on the street, but no one met her eyes or offered assistance. A woman alone at dusk was either trouble or trouble adjacent, and in a frontier town like this, people minded their own business. The general store was still open, light spilling from its windows onto the boardwalk. Victoria paused outside, gathering her courage, then pushed through the door. The warmth inside was so sudden and welcome that she nearly gasped, and the smell of coffee, tobacco, and dry goods filled her nose with an almost overwhelming intensity. An older man behind the counter looked up from his ledger, his expression moving from polite interest to wariness as he took in her appearance. Victoria knew what he saw: a young woman, clearly not from town, with no escort and desperation written across her face. "Evening, madam," he said neutrally. "Store's closing in about 10 minutes. "Please," Victoria said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I need help. I was brought here under false pretenses and left at an abandoned building. I've almost no money and nowhere to stay. Is there a boarding house in town? Or perhaps someone who might need a seamstress or cook?" The shopkeeper's expression softened slightly, but he shook his head. "Nearest boarding house worth staying at is Mrs. Patterson's, but she's full up with officers' families from the fort. There's rooms above the saloon, but that's no place for a decent woman." He paused, studying her face. "You said you were left here? By who?" "My late husband's family," Victoria said quietly. They told me they were bringing me to a boarding house, but the building they left me at is empty and damaged. The old Morrison place, the shopkeeper said with a sigh. Been empty for 2 years. That's a cruel thing to do. Especially in this weather, we're supposed to get a bad storm tonight. Temperature's going to drop well below zero. Victoria felt her heart sink even further. Is there nothing? I can work. I am strong and healthy, and I have experience with sewing, cooking, cleaning. I simply need a chance. The shopkeeper opened his mouth to respond, but the door opened behind Victoria, bringing with it another blast of cold air and the sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor. She stepped aside instinctively, and a tall man moved past her toward the counter. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat dusted with snow, a worn hat pulled low, and a red bandana around his neck. His face was weathered but handsome, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of stubble and eyes the color of storm clouds. Evening, Bernard, the shopkeeper said with considerably more warmth. Got those supplies ready for you. Was hoping you would make it before the storm hits. Just barely, the man said, his voice deep and rough with cold. Roads are already getting bad. This is going to be a brutal one. He glanced at Victoria, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment, and she saw curiosity there before he turned back to the shopkeeper. Henry, you got everything on the list? I do not want to have to come back into town for a while if this weather holds. Everything except the molasses, Henry said, moving toward the back of the store. Shipment got delayed, should be here next week if the road's clear. The man called Bernard nodded and began examining some rope hanging on a nearby hook. Victoria watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the easy confidence in his movements and the quality of his boots despite their worn appearance. This was a man who worked hard but was not destitute. The shopkeeper had greeted him with respect and familiarity. Henry returned with a wooden crate filled with supplies and set it on the counter with a grunt. That's 50 pounds of flour, 20 of cornmeal, 10 of sugar, 5 of coffee, the salt pork, beans, dried apples, and the rest. Comes to $12.60. Bernard pulled out a leather pouch and counted out coins, then paused as Henry cleared his throat meaningfully and glanced toward Victoria. The two men exchanged a look that Victoria could not quite interpret, and then Bernard turned to face her directly. Pardon me, madam, he said politely, touching the brim of his hat. Could not help but overhear part of your conversation with Henry. You are looking for work and lodging? Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassed to have her desperate situation witnessed by a stranger, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Yes, sir. I find myself in difficult circumstances through no fault of my own, and I need to find a way to support myself. Bernard studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. You said you can cook and clean? Sew? Yes, sir. I worked as a seamstress in Denver before my marriage, and I'm capable of all manner of household tasks. Your husband passed? He asked gently. 3 weeks ago, Victoria said, her voice catching slightly. Fever. Bernard nodded slowly, then seemed to come to some internal decision. I have a ranch about 8 miles north of here, run it myself with help from 2 hired men who have their own place down the road. It is hard, isolated work, and the house is not fancy. I have been managing on my own for the past year since my housekeeper moved to Cheyenne to live with her daughter, but I confess the place has gotten away from me a bit. I could use someone who can keep house and cook decent meals. In return, I can offer room and board and $30 a month. Victoria stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. $30 a month was generous wages for housekeeping, and room and board meant she would not be sleeping in an abandoned building tonight. But caution made her hesitate. She knew nothing about this man, and accepting a position in an isolated ranch with a stranger could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. Bernard seemed to read her thoughts because he said, It is a proper arrangement, madam. You would have your own room with a lock on the door. My hired men, Charlie and Tom, can vouch for my character, and so can Henry here and half the town. I am not offering anything improper, just honest work for honest pay. But I understand if you are uncomfortable with the idea. Henry nodded vigorously. Bernard Jameson's as decent a man as you will find in Wyoming, madam. Had this store for 20 years and never known him to be anything but honest and fair. Victoria looked between the two men, weighing her options. She could refuse and try to find something else, but what? The store was closing, night was falling, a dangerous storm was coming, and she had nowhere to go. Or she could accept this offer from a stranger and hope that the shopkeeper's endorsement was accurate. "I would need to leave within the hour to beat the worst of the storm," Bernard said quietly. "So I need an answer soon. But I want you to feel safe with your decision, whatever it is." "I accept," Victoria heard herself say, the words coming out before she could second-guess herself further. "Thank you, Mr. Jameson. I will work hard and earn my keep, I promise you that." Something that might have been relief crossed Bernard's face, though it was gone so quickly Victoria was not sure she had seen it at all. "Good. That's settled then. Henry, add some woman's supplies to my order, soap, whatever else you think she might need, and wrap up some of those peppermints." "I have a few personal items," Victoria said quickly, gesturing to her carpet bag. "You do not need to purchase things for me." "Consider it an advance on your first month's wages," Bernard said firmly. "You cannot keep house without proper supplies." While Henry bustled about gathering additional items, Bernard carried his crate outside to load onto what Victoria could now see was a sturdy wagon hitched to two large draft horses. The animals stamped and snorted in the cold, their breath steaming in the lamplight from the store. Victoria stood on the boardwalk watching Bernard work with efficient, economical movements that spoke of years of practice. He moved the original crate to make room for the additional supplies, then covered everything with a heavy canvas tarp that he secured with practiced knots. Henry emerged with a smaller crate and a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "Here you are. Added some tea and a few other things I thought might be useful. And there is a warm blanket in that bundle. You will need it for the ride." "Thank you," Victoria said sincerely. "You have been very kind." "Just doing what is right," Henry said gruffly. "Bernard will take good care of you. You have my word on that." Bernard lifted the new supplies into the wagon, then turned to Victoria and offered his hand to help her up onto the bench seat. His grip was strong and steady, and Victoria found herself seated beside him with her carpet bag at her feet and the bundled blanket in her lap. Bernard unwrapped it and draped it over her shoulders, then pulled out a second blanket from under the seat and spread it across both their laps. "Going to be a cold ride," he said, gathering the reins. "Keep that blanket tight around you and try to stay as warm as you can. Once we get moving, there's not much shelter from the wind." He clicked his tongue, and the horses moved forward, their massive bodies leaning into the harness as the wagon began to roll down the frozen street. Victoria looked back once at the general store, at Henry standing in the doorway watching them leave, and then she faced forward into the darkness and the unknown that lay ahead. The wind hit them with full force once they left the shelter of the town buildings, and Victoria understood immediately why Bernard had been concerned. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing minute, and the wind carried stinging particles of ice that felt like needles against any exposed skin. She pulled the blanket up around her face until only her eyes were visible, and even then she had to squint against the assault of the wind. Bernard drove with quiet competence, his hands steady on the reins and his body relaxed despite the brutal conditions. He seemed to know every rut and turn of the road without needing to see clearly, and the horses responded to his commands with the trust of long familiarity. They traveled in silence for the first 20 minutes, the howl of the wind making conversation nearly impossible. Then Bernard leaned closer and raised his voice to be heard over the storm. "There is a way station about halfway. We will stop there to let the horses rest and get warm for a few minutes." Victoria nodded to show she had heard, not trusting her frozen lips to form words. Her toes were completely numb now despite her boots, and her fingers ached with cold even inside her gloves. She had never experienced cold like this in Denver, and she was beginning to understand why people spoke of Wyoming winters with such respect and fear. True to his word, Bernard pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small, squat building that materialized out of the darkness. It was hardly more than a shed, but it had 4 walls and a roof, and that was enough. Bernard jumped down and came around to help Victoria, who found that her legs were so stiff with cold that she nearly fell. Bernard caught her easily, his arms strong around her waist. "Easy now," he said. "Let me help you inside, then I will see to the horses." He guided her to the door and pushed it open, revealing a small space with a stone fireplace, a rough bench, and not much else. But someone had left wood stacked beside the hearth, and within minutes Bernard had a fire blazing. The warmth was almost painful as sensation began to return to Victoria's extremities, and she held her hands out toward the flames with a shaky sigh of relief. "Stay here and warm up," Bernard instructed. "I am going to walk the horses around a bit so they do not stiffen up. Then I will water them. There's a pump outside." He disappeared back into the storm, leaving Victoria alone with the crackling fire. She removed her gloves and flexed her fingers, wincing at the pins and needles sensation. Her cheeks burned as they thawed, and she became aware that her entire body was shaking, whether from cold or delayed shock or both. She was not sure. She stood and walked around the small space, trying to restore circulation to her legs and feet. The reality of what she had just done was beginning to sink in. She had accepted a position from a complete stranger and was now traveling through a blizzard to his isolated ranch where she would be almost entirely dependent on his goodwill and protection. It was reckless and desperate, and yet what choice had she really had? Freeze to death in Fort Laramie or take a chance on Bernard Jameson's decency? The door opened and Bernard entered, bringing a blast of cold air and snow with him. He closed the door quickly and removed his hat, shaking off the accumulated snow. His dark hair was frosted white, and his eyebrows and the stubble on his jaw were rimmed with ice. "Horses are good," he said, moving to the fire to warm his own hands. "We will rest here for about 10 minutes, then push on. The worst of the road is behind us, and once we get over the next ridge, we will have some shelter from the wind." "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice hoarse from the cold, "for stopping here, and for everything else." Bernard glanced at her, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "You do not need to thank me for common decency. No one should be left out in weather like this." He paused, then added, "I'm sorry about your husband. That is a hard thing, especially so young." "He was a good man," Victoria said softly. "Kind. We did not have much time together, but I cared for him. His family had no right to treat you the way they did," Bernard said with a hint of anger in his voice, "abandoning you like that. It is unconscionable." Victoria looked down at her hands. "They never wanted me in the family. I was not good enough in their eyes. Thomas married beneath himself, or so his mother told me more than once." "Then his mother was a fool," Bernard said bluntly. "A person's character matters a hell of a lot more than their pedigree. Pardon my language." Victoria found herself smiling slightly despite everything. "I have heard worse, and I appreciate the sentiment." They stood in companionable silence for a few more minutes, warming themselves by the fire. Victoria studied Bernard covertly, taking in details she had not noticed before. He was probably in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, with the kind of lean, muscular build that came from years of hard physical labor. His hands were scarred and calloused, his face weathered by sun and wind. But there was something fundamentally kind in his expression when he thought no one was watching. "We should go," Bernard said finally. "Fire is good and hot now, so it will stay warm in here for the next traveler, but we need to get home before this storm gets any worse." They bundled up again and returned to the wagon, where the horses stood with snow accumulating on their broad backs. Bernard helped Victoria up to the seat, then climbed up beside her and urged the horses forward. The second half of the journey was somewhat easier, as Bernard had promised. The road curved around a ridge that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind, and the horses seemed to sense they were heading home, their pace quickening despite the difficult conditions. Victoria dozed fitfully against Bernard's shoulder, too exhausted and cold to maintain full consciousness. She was vaguely aware of the wagon's movement, the creak of wood and jingle of harness, and the solid warmth of the man beside her. Time seemed to stretch and compress unpredictably, and she was not sure if they had been traveling for hours or minutes when Bernard's voice broke through her half-sleep. "We are here. Come on, let me get you inside." Victoria opened her eyes to find they had stopped in front of a low, sprawling ranch house. Light glowed in the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney, bent horizontal by the wind. Bernard jumped down and reached up for her, and this time when her legs refused to support her weight, he simply lifted her in his arms and carried her toward the house. The front door opened before they reached it, and warmth and light spilled out. Bernard carried her inside and set her carefully on a chair near the fireplace where a good fire was burning. Victoria's vision swam as the heat hit her, and she heard Bernard's voice as if from a great distance. "Get some hot coffee or tea into her and find some extra blankets. She's half frozen." Victoria's awareness faded in and out as people moved around her. Someone removed her wet shawl and draped dry blankets around her shoulders. A cup of hot liquid was pressed into her hands, and a gentle voice encouraged her to drink. She obeyed automatically, tasting strong tea sweetened with honey, and the warmth that spread through her chest and belly was the most wonderful sensation she had ever experienced. Gradually, as her body temperature returned to normal, her surroundings came into clearer focus. She was sitting in a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area. The furniture was simple but well made, consisting of a long wooden table with benches, several chairs near the fireplace, and shelves lined with books and supplies. Everything was clean but had the slightly neglected air of a space maintained by someone who saw it purely as functional rather than a home. The person who had given her tea was a young man of perhaps 20, with sandy hair and friendly blue eyes. He hovered nearby with obvious concern, and when he saw Victoria looking at him, he offered a shy smile. "Feeling better, madam? You gave us quite a scare." "Yes, thank you," Victoria managed. "Much better." "I am Tom," the young man said. "Me and Charlie work for Mr. Jameson. Charlie is out helping him get the horses settled and the supplies unloaded. Real glad you made it here safely. That is a terrible storm." As if to emphasize his words, the wind howled around the house, rattling the windows in their frames. Victoria shuddered, thinking about what would have happened if she had been forced to spend the night in that abandoned building in Fort Laramie. The door opened again, and two men entered, bringing snow and cold air with them. Bernard had removed his coat, and Victoria could see he wore a faded blue shirt and worn denim trousers held up with suspenders. The other man was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and the bow-legged walk of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. "Horses are bedded down, and the supplies are in the barn for now," Bernard said, moving to the fire to warm his hands. "We will bring everything in tomorrow when the storm passes. Charlie, Tom, this is Mrs. Morgan. She's going to be keeping house for us from now on." Charlie touched his hat respectfully. "Madam, welcome to the Jameson Ranch. Hope you will be comfortable here." "Thank you," Victoria said. "I appreciate your kindness." Bernard looked at Tom. "Show Mrs. Morgan to the spare room, would you? Make sure there is fresh bedding and the stove is lit. She needs to rest." Tom nodded eagerly and gestured for Victoria to follow him. She stood, pleased to find that her legs were steady now, and picked up her carpet bag. Tom led her down a short hallway off the main room, past two closed doors to a third door at the end. "This was where Mrs. Henderson stayed when she was here," Tom explained, opening the door. "Mr. Jameson had me come by earlier this week to clean it out and air it, though I do not reckon he knew why at the time. Funny how things work out." The room was small but cozy, with a single bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a simple dresser with a mirror above it, a chair, and a small cast-iron stove that was indeed radiating comfortable heat. A single window looked out onto the darkness and swirling snow, but heavy curtains could be drawn for privacy and additional warmth. "There is water in that pitcher," Tom said, pointing to the dresser, "and the privy is out back, though in this weather you might want to use the chamber pot under the bed. Breakfast is usually around dawn, but tomorrow Mr. Jameson said to let you sleep as long as you need." "Thank you, Tom. You have been very helpful." Tom blushed and ducked his head. "Just doing what is right, madam. You have had a hard day. Sleep well." He closed the door as he left, and Victoria heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. She stood in the middle of the small room looking around at what was now her home, and felt tears prick at her eyes. It was not much, but it was warm and safe, and she had earned it through her own decision and courage. She was not helpless. She had found a way to survive. Victoria unpacked her few belongings, hanging her 2 spare dresses on pegs on the wall and arranging her personal items on the dresser. She found a clean nightgown at the bottom of her carpet bag and changed into it, grateful beyond words to be removing the damp, cold clothes she had been wearing. The bed was soft and the quilts were heavy and warm, and within minutes of lying down, Victoria fell into the deep, dreamless sleep of utter exhaustion. She woke to pale daylight filtering through the curtains and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment she was disoriented, not remembering where she was, and then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She sat up and looked around the room, which appeared much more cheerful in the morning light. The storm seemed to have passed, and when she peeked through the curtains, she saw a world transformed into white drifts and icicles sparkling in the weak winter sun. Victoria dressed quickly in one of her better dresses, a dark blue wool that was worn but clean and flattering. She brushed out her long chestnut hair and braided it into a simple plait that hung down her back, then pinched her cheeks to bring some color into them. When she looked in the small mirror, she saw a young woman with hazel eyes and a determined expression, and she felt a flicker of pride. She was a survivor. The main room was empty when she emerged, but a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove and covered dishes suggested breakfast had been prepared and left for her. Victoria poured herself coffee and uncovered the dishes to find bacon, eggs, and biscuits. She ate standing up, too curious about her new surroundings to sit down, and began to assess the state of the household. It was clear that Bernard had not been exaggerating when he said the place had gotten away from him. The floors needed sweeping, the windows were filmed with dust, and the shelves and surfaces had the cluttered appearance of items set down and never properly put away. The stove needed cleaning, the curtains needed washing, and she suspected that if she checked the sleeping quarters and storage areas, she would find considerably more work waiting. But it was honest work, and it was work she knew how to do. Victoria rolled up her sleeves and began. She started with the main room, sweeping the floors thoroughly and organizing the cluttered shelves into something more logical. She washed the windows until they sparkled, scrubbed down the table and benches, and cleaned the stove until the iron gleamed. She found linens that needed washing and began heating water for laundry. The work was familiar and soothing, and she lost herself in the rhythm of it. She was elbow-deep in soapy water, scrubbing a stubborn stain from a tablecloth, when the front door opened and Bernard entered. He stopped short when he saw the transformation of the room, his eyes widening in surprise. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, "you should be resting. You had a difficult journey yesterday." "I feel much better after a good night's sleep," Victoria said, wringing out the tablecloth and hanging it over a line she had strung near the stove. "And I wanted to earn my keep. This is what you hired me for, is it not?" "Well, yes, but I did not expect you to start immediately." Bernard removed his hat and coat, hanging them on pegs by the door. "I thought you would need at least a day to recover and settle in." "Work is the best way to settle in," Victoria said firmly. "Now I have taken an inventory of supplies in the kitchen, and I will need a more complete tour of the house and outbuildings so I know what I'm working with. I also want to understand your routines and preferences for meals and household management." Bernard stared at her for a moment. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his serious expression into something warm and almost boyish. "You do not waste time, do you?" "Time is the one thing we can never get back," Victoria said. "I learned that when Thomas died, so no, I do not waste it." Something flickered in Bernard's eyes, something like respect, and he nodded. "All right then, let me show you around properly." He took her through the house, which consisted of the large main room, his bedroom, a small office, the spare room where Victoria slept, and a storage room filled with supplies and equipment. The house was solidly built, with good bones, but it showed the effects of a year without a woman's touch. Victoria mentally cataloged everything that needed attention and began prioritizing tasks. Then Bernard took her outside, where the sun was already climbing higher in a cloudless sky. The storm had left nearly 2 feet of snow, but paths had been cleared to the barn. the bunkhouse where Charlie and Tom slept, and the various outbuildings. Bernard showed her the chicken coop with its flock of hens, the smokehouse, the root cellar, and the barn where horses, milk cows, and winter supplies were kept. "We run cattle mostly," Bernard explained as they walked. "Have about 200 head spread out over 3,000 acres of range. Winter is the quiet time, mostly just making sure the animals have what they need and survive until spring. Come calving season in March and April, things get a lot busier. We also have the horses, which I breed and train for sale. And the chickens and cows give us eggs and milk and meat for our own use." "Do you sell produce or dairy goods, moi?" Victoria asked, her practical mind already working on possibilities. "Used to when Mrs. Henderson was here. She made excellent butter and cheese that fetch good prices in town, but I have not had time to keep up with that kind of work." "I can do that," Victoria said. "My mother taught me to make butter and cheese, and if there is enough milk, I can make extra to sell." Bernard looked at her with that expression of surprised respect again. "You really do not waste any time, do you? Already thinking about how to improve operations?" "I told you I would earn my keep," Victoria said simply. They returned to the house, and Victoria spent the rest of the day continuing her cleaning and reorganization while also preparing dinner for the household. She found a ham in the smokehouse, potatoes in the root cellar, and the preserved vegetables and dried goods she needed to make a hearty meal. When Bernard, Charlie, and Tom came in for dinner as the sun was setting, they stopped in their tracks at the sight of the table laid with proper plates and cutlery and steaming dishes of food. "Good Lord," Charlie said reverently. "That is the finest-looking meal I have seen in a year." "Smells like heaven," Tom added, his eyes wide. Bernard said nothing, but the gratitude in his expression spoke volumes. They all sat down, and Victoria served the meal, feeling a deep satisfaction as the men ate with obvious appreciation. Good food and a clean, warm home were simple things, but they mattered. They made the difference between merely surviving and actually living. After dinner, the men retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving Bernard and Victoria alone in the house. Victoria washed the dishes while Bernard sat at the table working on ledgers and paperwork. The domesticity of it was both strange and comforting, and Victoria found herself stealing glances at her employer as she worked. He was a hard man to read, she realized. He spoke little, and his face rarely betrayed strong emotion. But there was a fundamental decency about him that showed in small ways. The gentleness with which he had treated her the previous night, the respect with which he spoke to Charlie and Tom, the care he took with his animals. He was not soft, but he was not hard in the way that some frontiermen were, worn down by isolation and difficulty until they had no kindness left. "Mrs. Morgan," Bernard said suddenly, looking up from his ledger, "I realize we did not discuss specifics of your employment beyond the basic terms. I think we should establish some ground rules so we both know what to expect." Victoria dried her hands on a towel and came to sit at the table across from him. "That sounds sensible. First, your primary responsibility is managing the household, cooking, cleaning, laundry, and related tasks. But this is a working ranch, and sometimes there are other needs. If I ask you to help with something like making butter or cheese to sell, or helping with the vegetable garden in summer, that is within your duties. If you feel I am asking too much or something that is not appropriate, you speak up, understood?" "Yes," Victoria said. "Second, you have your own space and privacy. That room is yours. I will not enter without knocking and receiving permission, and I expect you to extend the same courtesy to my room and office." "Of course." "Third, you are entitled to 1 day off each week. Sunday is traditionally the day of rest, and while there are always chores that need doing, I will manage them or handle them with Charlie and Tom so you can have time to yourself." "That is very generous," Victoria said, surprised. "Many employers did not give household help any days off at all." "It is fair," Bernard corrected. "Everyone needs rest. And fourth, if at any time you feel unsafe or uncomfortable, you tell me immediately. My hired men are good people, but if they or anyone else bothers you, I need to know." "I appreciate that," Victoria said sincerely. "But I need to make some things clear as well. I am a widow in mourning, Mr. Jameson. I am grateful for this employment and your kindness, but I'm not looking for anything beyond a professional arrangement. I hope that's understood." "Completely," Bernard said firmly. "I offered you employment, Mrs. Morgan, not anything else. Your personal life is your own business." They looked at each other across the table, and Victoria felt something settle inside her, a sense of safety and rightness. This could work. This arrangement could actually work. The winter days fell into a steady rhythm after that. Victoria woke early each morning to start breakfast and prepare coffee before the men came in from their morning chores. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, mending, and managing the household with efficient competence. The house gradually transformed under her care, becoming not just clean, but genuinely comfortable, with small touches that made it feel like a home. Curtains she had washed and mended hanging crisp and bright in the windows, furniture polished until it gleamed, the perpetual smell of fresh bread and good cooking. Bernard watched the transformation with quiet appreciation, and Victoria sometimes caught him looking around the main room with an expression that suggested he was seeing it for the first time in years. He was not effusive with praise, but he showed his gratitude in practical ways, making sure she had everything she needed, listening when she made suggestions about improvements or purchases, and treating her with consistent respect. Charlie and Tom were equally appreciative, and Victoria quickly grew fond of both men. Charlie was quiet and steady, a widower himself who had worked for Bernard for nearly 5 years. Tom was younger and more talkative, full of stories and enthusiasm, and he reminded Victoria of the younger brothers she had left behind in Ohio when she moved west. Both men treated her with polite deference, and she felt completely safe in their presence. As January gave way to February, Victoria ventured into more ambitious projects. She began making butter and cheese from the surplus milk, and the quality was good enough that Bernard began taking it to town to sell. She organized the storage areas, taking inventory of supplies and making lists of what would be needed for spring. She mended clothing and linens that had been neglected for months, and she began planning a vegetable garden for the summer. She also began to learn more about Bernard Jameson himself, picking up details from casual conversations and observations. He had been born in Missouri but came west at 17, working various jobs before saving enough money to buy this land 5 years ago. He had never been married, though Victoria suspected from things Charlie let slip that there had been a woman once who had broken his heart. He read voraciously, working his way through the books on his shelves during the long winter evenings. He had a dry sense of humor that emerged at unexpected moments, and he was unfailingly fair in his dealings with everyone, whether he was negotiating prices in town or settling minor disputes between his hired men. Victoria also noticed that Bernard seemed to be taking more care with his appearance as the weeks passed. He shaved more regularly, kept his hair trimmed, and she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret. She told herself it meant nothing, that he was simply pleased with her work. But there was something in the way his eyes followed her movements that made her heart beat a little faster. She reminded herself sternly that she was in mourning, that it had only been 2 months since Thomas died, and that it would be completely inappropriate to develop feelings for her employer. But the heart did not always listen to reason, and Victoria could not deny that she found Bernard attractive. It was not just his physical appearance, though he was certainly handsome in a rough, weathered way. It was his competence, his kindness, his quiet strength. It was the way he treated her as an equal rather than a servant. It was the sound of his voice and the rare flash of his smile. One evening in mid-February, Victoria was preparing dinner when Bernard came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots. He hung up his coat and came to warm his hands by the stove, standing close enough that Victoria was intensely aware of his presence. "Smells wonderful," he said, looking into the pot where stew was simmering. "What is the occasion?" "No occasion," Victoria said, stirring the stew to cover her sudden nervousness. "I found some beef in the smokehouse that needed to be used, and I thought stew would be good on a cold night." "Everything you make is good," Bernard said. "I think I have gained 10 pounds since you got here." Victoria laughed. "I doubt that. You work too hard to gain weight." "Maybe so." He paused, then said, "Mrs. Morgan, I wanted to ask you something." Victoria looked up at him, her heart suddenly pounding. Yes? I need to make a trip to Cheyenne next week. There is a horse auction I want to attend, and I need to meet with some potential buyers for the spring calves. I will be gone for about 4 days. I wanted to make sure you are comfortable being here with just Charlie and Tom. If you are not, I can postpone the trip or arrange for someone else to stay at the house. I will be fine, Victoria said, touched by his consideration, but also slightly disappointed that his question had been purely practical. Charlie and Tom are perfect gentlemen, and I am not afraid to be here without you. I did not think you would be, Bernard said with a slight smile. You do not seem to be afraid of much, but I wanted to ask. I appreciate that, Victoria said. And while you are in Cheyenne, perhaps you could pick up some supplies I need. I will make you a list. Of course, whatever you need. They stood there for a moment, the air between them feeling charged with something unspoken, and then Bernard cleared his throat and stepped back. I should go wash up before dinner. He disappeared down the hallway, and Victoria released a breath she had not realized she was holding. This was becoming complicated in ways she had not anticipated, and she was not sure what to do about it. Bernard left for Cheyenne on a clear, cold Monday morning, and the house felt strangely empty without his presence. Victoria threw herself into work, taking advantage of his absence to deep clean his office and bedroom, tasks that felt too intrusive to do when he was home. She found his spaces were as meticulously organized as his mind seemed to be, with everything in its place and nothing frivolous or unnecessary. On the third night of his absence, Victoria was sitting by the fire after dinner, mending one of Tom's shirts when she heard the sound of a horse approaching fast. Tom had left earlier to check on a cow that was showing signs of illness, and Charlie was in the bunkhouse, so Victoria set down her mending and went to the door cautiously. A man on horseback pulled up in front of the house, and Victoria's heart sank when she recognized the horse and rider. It was Samuel Morgan, Thomas's younger brother, and his presence here could only mean trouble. Mrs. Morgan, Samuel said, dismounting and approaching the porch, we need to talk. I have nothing to say to you or your family, Victoria said coldly, remaining in the doorway. You made your feelings very clear when you abandoned me in Fort Laramie. That was my mother's doing, not mine, Samuel said. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I did not know what she was planning, or I would have stopped her, but I am here now because I have news that concerns you. Victoria hesitated, then stepped back. You can come in for a few minutes, but Charlie and Tom are nearby, so do not think of trying anything. Samuel entered and removed his hat, looking around the room with undisguised curiosity. You have landed on your feet, I see. I heard in town you were working as a housekeeper out here. What do you want, Samuel? Victoria asked bluntly. There is a problem with Thomas's estate, Samuel said. When we went through his papers more carefully, we found a will. He left everything to you. His share of the family ranch, his personal savings, everything. It amounts to about $3,000 in value. Victoria stared at him, stunned. Thomas left me an inheritance? Yes, and my mother is furious about it. She has been to a lawyer trying to find a way to contest the will, but it is legally sound. The money and property are yours. Why are you telling me this? Victoria asked suspiciously. What does your mother want? She wants to buy you out, Samuel said. She is willing to pay you $2,000 cash for your share of the ranch and your claim to Thomas's personal effects. That is less than it is worth, but it is a substantial sum of money, and you would not have to deal with lawyers or fighting with the family. Victoria's mind raced. $2,000 was indeed a substantial sum, enough to establish her independence completely. But it was also $700 less than what was rightfully hers, and the fact that Mrs. Morgan was trying to cheat her even in this made Victoria's blood boil. Tell your mother no, Victoria said firmly. If Thomas left me an inheritance, I will claim what is legally mine. All of it. Samuel sighed. I thought you might say that. Look, Mrs. Morgan, I think my mother treated you poorly, and I am sorry for that. But you should know that she is not going to make this easy. She will drag this out in court and make it as difficult and expensive as possible. Let her try, Victoria said. I am not afraid of your mother, Samuel, and I'm not going to let her bully me into accepting less than what Thomas wanted me to have. Fair enough. Samuel put his hat back on and moved toward the door, then paused. For what it is worth, Thomas talked about you a lot before he died. He really cared about you, and I think he would be glad to know you found a safe place to land. After he left, Victoria sank into a chair by the fire, her mind whirling. Thomas had left her an inheritance. She was not penniless. She had resources and options. The knowledge was empowering, but it was also overwhelming. When Bernard returned from Cheyenne 2 days later, Victoria told him everything. He listened carefully, his expression growing increasingly angry as she described the Morgan family's attempts to cheat her. You need a lawyer, he said when she finished, a good one who will not be intimidated by the Morgan family's tactics. I do not know any lawyers in Wyoming, Victoria admitted. I do, Bernard said. Met him in Cheyenne, actually. Good man, honest, and he does not back down from a fight. His name is Robert Chen, and he has helped me with several business matters. I can write him on your behalf if you like. I would appreciate that very much, Victoria said. Thank you. You do not need to thank me, Bernard said, echoing his words from that first night. It is just the right thing to do. Over the following weeks, Victoria corresponded with Mr. Chen through Bernard's help, and the lawyer confirmed that Thomas's will was legally sound and that Victoria was entitled to her full inheritance. He also warned that Mrs. Morgan was indeed preparing to contest the will and that the process would likely take several months. That is fine, Victoria told Bernard when he relayed this information. I am not going anywhere. Something flickered in Bernard's eyes at her words, something that looked like relief and pleasure, but he only nodded. Good. I am glad to hear it. As February turned to March, the weather began to slowly shift toward spring. The days grew incrementally longer. The snow began to melt in earnest, and the first signs of new life appeared in the form of pussy willows and early wildflowers. The cattle began calving, which meant long days and sometimes nights for Bernard, Charlie, and Tom as they helped deliver calves and made sure both mothers and babies survived the vulnerable first days. Victoria supported them by keeping hot food and coffee always available, and sometimes she went out to the barn herself to help with particularly difficult births or to bottle feed calves whose mothers could not nurse them. It was hard, messy work, but she found it satisfying in a way that surprised her. There was something deeply right about being part of the cycle of life, about working with your hands to help new life enter the world. One night in late March, Victoria was awakened by a knock on her door. She grabbed a shawl and opened it to find Bernard standing in the hallway, his expression urgent. I need your help, he said. We have a mare foaling and it is not going well. I have delivered dozens of foals, but this one is breech, and I need someone with smaller hands to help turn it. Victoria did not hesitate. She threw on a dress over her nightgown, pulled on boots, and followed Bernard out to the barn. The mare was in clear distress, pacing in her stall and occasionally lying down only to struggle back to her feet. Bernard had Tom holding the mare's head, speaking softly to keep her calm, while Charlie stood ready with supplies. Here, Bernard said, rolling up his sleeves. I'm going to try to turn the foal, but if I cannot get it, you will need to try. Your hands are smaller and might have better luck. For the next hour, Victoria worked alongside Bernard in intense concentration, following his instructions as they tried to save both mare and foal. It was frightening and exhilarating, and when the foal finally emerged in a rush of fluid and membrane, Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes. There, Bernard said, his voice rough with emotion. There, you beautiful girl. The foal was a filly dark bay with a white star on her forehead, and within minutes she was struggling to stand on impossibly long legs. The mare, exhausted but already nickering to her baby, began to clean her with long strokes of her tongue. Victoria looked down at her hands covered in blood and birth fluids, and then at Bernard, who was equally messy. Their eyes met, and suddenly they were both laughing, giddy with relief and exhaustion and the simple joy of having helped bring new life into the world. Thank you, Bernard said, his smile bright and genuine. I could not have done that without you. Yes, you could have, Victoria said, but she was smiling too. But I am glad I could help. They stood there in the barn, watching the mare and filly bond, and Victoria became acutely aware of Bernard's presence beside her. When he reached out and gently wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek, she felt the touch all the way through her body. Victoria, he said softly, using her given name for the first time. I need to tell you something. Her heart began to pound. Yes? I know it has not been very long since your husband passed, and I know this is probably not appropriate, but I cannot keep pretending I do not have feelings for you. You are the most capable, courageous, genuine person I have ever met, and every day I find myself more drawn to you. I am not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know. Victoria looked up at him, at his honest gray eyes and the vulnerability in his expression, and something in her chest cracked open. Bernard, she whispered, I feel the same way. I have been trying not to because it seems too soon and too complicated, but I cannot help it. He reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and strong. We do not have to rush anything. We can take as much time as you need, but I wanted you to know that I care about you and not just as an employee. I care about you too, Victoria said, her voice shaking slightly. You have given me so much more than just employment and shelter. You have given me hope and purpose and made me feel valued in a way I never have before. Bernard lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, and the gesture was so tender that Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes again. You are valued, he said fiercely. You are remarkable, Victoria Morgan, and anyone who could not see that is a fool. They stood there in the barn as dawn began to break outside, holding hands and watching the new foal, and Victoria felt something fundamental shift inside her. This was not the passionate whirlwind romance that people wrote stories about. This was something deeper and more real, a connection built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. It was careful and considered, and all the more powerful for it. Over the following weeks, Victoria and Bernard began to tentatively explore their feelings for each other. He was scrupulously respectful, never pushing for more than she was comfortable giving, but there were small gestures that spoke of growing intimacy. His hand on her shoulder as he passed, her fingers lingering on his when she handed him his coffee, long conversations in the evening after the work was done. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears, their experiences. Bernard told her about growing up in a large family in Missouri, the youngest of 7 children, and how he had always felt called to the West and the freedom it represented. Victoria told him about her strict upbringing in Ohio, her parents' early deaths from cholera, and how she had made her way alone to Denver looking for a fresh start. You have always been brave, Bernard observed one evening as they sat together by the fire. Even before all of this, it takes courage to strike out on your own the way you did. I did not feel brave, Victoria admitted. I felt terrified most of the time, but I also knew I could not stay where I was. Sometimes you have to choose between fear and stagnation, and fear at least offers the possibility of something better. That is wisdom, Bernard said, and it is one of the things I admire most about you. You do not let fear stop you from moving forward. In late April, Mr. Chen sent word that he had successfully defeated Mrs. Morgan's challenge to the will, and that Victoria's inheritance would be transferred to her within the month. It was a victory, but Victoria found that the news did not bring the satisfaction she had expected. The money was useful, certainly, but it felt less important now than it had when she first learned of it. What will you do with it? Bernard asked when she told him the news. His expression was carefully neutral, but Victoria sensed tension beneath his calm exterior. I am not sure yet, Victoria said honestly. Part of me wants to invest it in something practical, like buying property or starting a business. Part of me thinks I should save it for emergencies, and part of me thinks I should use some of it to help people who are in the situation I was in, desperate and alone with nowhere to turn. Those are all good options, Bernard said. You do not have to decide right away? No, Victoria agreed. Then, taking a breath, she added, but there is one thing I'm sure of. I'm not leaving here, Bernard. This is my home now, if you will let me stay." The tension in his expression dissolved into something like joy. "Let you stay? Victoria? There's nothing I want more. But I do not want you to stay just as my housekeeper. I want more than that, if you are willing." "What do you want?" Victoria asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "I want to court you properly," Bernard said. "I want to take you to church socials and dances. I want to introduce you to people as the woman I'm falling in love with, not my employee. And eventually, if you feel the same way, I want to marry you. But only if that is what you want too." Victoria felt happiness bloom in her chest, bright and warm as the spring sun. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Bernard's smile was radiant, and he reached out to cup her face in his hands. "Can I kiss you?" "Please," Victoria whispered, and when his lips met hers it felt like coming home. The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise and tenderness. When they finally pulled apart, Bernard rested his forehead against hers and sighed contentedly. "I will do everything I can to make you happy," he said softly. "I swear it." "You already have," Victoria said, "just by seeing me for who I am and valuing that. That is all I ever wanted." True to his word, Bernard began courting Victoria properly. On Sundays, they attended church together in Fort Laramie, where Victoria was welcomed into the community with genuine warmth. Word had spread about how she had been abandoned by the Morgan family and how Bernard had taken her in, and public opinion was firmly on her side. Mrs. Morgan, meanwhile, had become something of a pariah, her cruelty and attempted theft of Victoria's inheritance earning her widespread condemnation. Victoria found she enjoyed being part of the community, participating in quilting bees and church socials and helping with various charitable endeavors. She used part of her inheritance to establish a small fund to help widows and other women in desperate circumstances, working with the church to identify people in need and provide them with assistance. Bernard was proud of her charitable work, and he supported her in it completely, sometimes contributing his own money to her causes. Together, they became respected members of the community known for their fairness, generosity, and genuine kindness. In early June, on a beautiful morning when wildflowers covered the prairie in a riot of color, Bernard proposed formally. He took Victoria riding out to a high overlook that showed the sweep of his ranch land stretching toward the mountains. And there, with the wind in their hair and the sun on their faces, he got down on one knee. "Victoria Morgan," he said, holding out a simple gold ring set with a small diamond. "You have transformed my life in ways I never imagined. You have turned my house into a home, my routine into a life worth living, and my solitary existence into something joyful. I love you more than I thought I could ever love anyone. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Victoria said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Bernard, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, and Victoria felt complete in a way she never had before. This was not the future she had imagined when she married Thomas or when the Morgan family abandoned her, but it was better than anything she could have dreamed. They were married in August in the small church in Fort Laramie with Charlie and Tom as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Victoria wore a new dress of cream silk that she had sewn herself, and Bernard wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Victoria's breath caught when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation broke into spontaneous applause. At the reception afterward, held in the church social hall, people came forward to congratulate them and share in their happiness. "You are good people," one elderly woman told Victoria, clasping her hands warmly, "and you deserve all the happiness in the world." "Thank you," Victoria said, her heart full. "I feel like the luckiest woman alive." That night, when they returned to the ranch as husband and wife, Bernard carried Victoria over the threshold in the traditional manner, both of them laughing. He set her down gently in the main room, which Charlie and Tom had decorated with wildflowers in their absence. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jameson," Bernard said softly. I have been home since the first night you brought me here, Victoria said, reaching up to touch his face. You gave me shelter when I had nothing. You gave me work when I needed purpose. And you gave me love when I thought I would never feel that way again. You saved my life, Bernard. No, Bernard said, pulling her close. We saved each other. I was just existing before you came, going through the motions. You made me want to truly live again. You made everything better and brighter and more meaningful. They kissed, and then Bernard swept her into his arms and carried her to what was now their shared bedroom. The door closed behind them, and the house settled into peaceful silence. The years that followed were not without challenges, but they were fundamentally happy. Victoria and Bernard built a true partnership, working together to expand the ranch and make it more prosperous. Victoria's butter and cheese business grew until they were supplying stores as far away as Cheyenne, and Bernard's horse breeding program developed a reputation for producing excellent stock. In the spring of 1880, Victoria gave birth to their first child, a boy they named William Thomas Jameson, combining Bernard's father's name with Thomas's name to honor the man whose death had inadvertently brought them together. William was a healthy, happy baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, whom they named Sarah Rose. She had her mother's chestnut hair and her father's stubborn streak, and she ruled the household with cheerful tyranny from the moment she could crawl. Charlie and Tom remained part of the family, watching the children grow with the affection of uncles. Tom eventually married a young woman from town and built his own small ranch nearby, while Charlie stayed on at the Jameson Ranch, claiming he was too old and set in his ways to change now. Victoria never forgot her difficult beginning in Wyoming, and she continued her charitable work throughout her life, helping countless women and families who found themselves in desperate circumstances. The fund she established grew over the years, supported by donations from throughout the community, and it became one of her greatest prides. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Bernard and Victoria rode back out to the overlook where he had proposed, leaving the children in Charlie's capable care for the afternoon. They stood together looking out over the land that was now truly theirs, their home, their legacy. Do you ever regret it? Bernard asked, his arm around her waist. Staying here instead of taking your inheritance and starting fresh somewhere else? Never, Victoria said firmly, not for a single moment. This is where I belong. With you, with our children, with this life we have built together. The Morgans thought they were punishing me when they left me in the cold that night, but they actually gave me the greatest gift because it brought me to you. I think about that night sometimes, Bernard admitted. How close I came to not going into town that day. If the storm had hit an hour earlier, or if I had decided to wait another day, I never would have met you. We would have missed each other completely. But we did not miss each other, Victoria said, turning to face him. We found each other against all odds, and we built something real and lasting and good. That is not luck or chance. That is something we chose every day to create together. Bernard kissed her tenderly. I love you, Victoria Jameson, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow. I love you too, Victoria said. Thank you for seeing me that night in the general store. Thank you for giving me a chance when I had nothing. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for trusting me enough to take that chance, Bernard said, and for everything that came after. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange. Down below they could see the ranch house with its cheerful windows and the smoke rising from the chimney. Home. Life continued its natural rhythm after that anniversary, with the seasons turning and the children growing. William proved to have a natural gift with horses like his father, spending hours in the barn learning to train and care for the animals. Sarah was more interested in her mother's business ventures, asking endless questions about how butter was made and where the money went, and why they helped people who had nothing. Because we remember what it is like to have nothing, Victoria told her daughter one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. Your father had to work very hard to build this ranch from bare land, and I arrived here with less than 50 cents to my name and nowhere to go. We do not forget that, and we do not forget that there are always people who need help." "But why did Grandmother Morgan try to take your money?" Sarah asked with a child's directness. Victoria paused, considering how to explain adult cruelty to a 6-year-old. "Because she was hurt and angry about her son dying, and she wanted to blame someone. Sometimes when people are in pain, they lash out at others instead of dealing with their own feelings." "That is not very nice," Sarah said firmly. "No, it is not," Victoria agreed. "But holding on to anger about it would not be nice either. So instead, I try to use what I learned from that experience to help other people. That way, something good comes from something bad." As the children grew older, Victoria and Bernard made sure they understood the importance of hard work, fairness, and compassion. They involved them in the ranch operations from an early age, teaching them that prosperity came from dedication and that privilege carried responsibility. William and Sarah both grew into kind, capable young people who made their parents proud. In the summer of 1885, when William was 5 and Sarah was 3, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous two, and she found herself tired and nauseous much of the time. Bernard was worried but supportive, taking over more of the household duties and insisting that Victoria rest whenever possible. In late winter of 1886, Victoria gave birth to twin boys, identical and impossibly small. The births were difficult, and for a time the doctor was not sure whether Victoria would survive. But her fundamental strength and determination, combined with excellent care from Bernard and a traveling nurse from the fort, saw her through. The twins, named James Bernard and Matthew Samuel, were healthy despite their early arrival and small size. Bernard was overwhelmed with joy and relief, and Victoria had never seen him cry until the moment he held both his new sons in his arms simultaneously. "4 children," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Victoria, we have 4 beautiful children." "We are very blessed," Victoria agreed weakly from the bed. "Though I think we might be done now. 4 seems like quite enough." Bernard laughed through his tears. "Whatever you say. I am just grateful you are alive and well. I do not know what I would do without you." "You will never have to find out," Victoria promised. "I am not going anywhere." The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of family life. First days of school, holidays and birthdays, triumphs and challenges. The ranch prospered, expanding its operations and becoming one of the most respected in the region. Victoria's charitable fund grew as well, helping dozens of families over the years. In 1890, when Victoria was 35 and Bernard was 37, they received an unexpected visitor. A young woman appeared at their door one winter afternoon, thin and exhausted, asking if they had any work available. She was about 20 years old, pregnant, and clearly desperate. Victoria and Bernard exchanged a long look, both of them remembering another young woman in similar circumstances 12 years earlier. "Come inside," Victoria said warmly, holding the door open. "Let us get you warm and fed, and then we can talk about what kind of help you need." The young woman's name was Eleanor, and her story was sadly familiar. A husband who had died suddenly, family who rejected her, nowhere to turn. Victoria and Bernard gave her one of the spare rooms they had added to the house over the years, and Victoria helped her prepare for the baby's arrival. When Eleanor's daughter was born in early spring, healthy and loud and perfect, Victoria held her and felt tears slip down her cheeks. She remembered holding her own babies, but she also remembered being that desperate young woman who needed help, and she was so grateful to be in a position to provide it. Eleanor stayed with them for 2 years, working as a second housekeeper and saving money. When she left, it was to marry a good man who owned a feed store in town and who loved her and her daughter without reservation. She and Victoria remained close friends for life. Over the years, Victoria and Bernard helped several other women in similar situations, providing employment, shelter, and a safe place to start over. It became something of a tradition at the Jameson Ranch that there was always room for one more person who needed help. "We cannot save everyone," Victoria said to Bernard one evening as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset. They were in their early 40s now, with silver beginning to thread through their hair, but the love between them had only deepened with time. No, Bernard agreed, his hand finding hers, but we can save some, and that matters. The children grew into adults, each finding their own path. William took over more and more of the ranch operations, showing his father's gift for breeding horses and his mother's head for business. Sarah went to Denver to study nursing, then returned to Fort Laramie to work at the new hospital that had been built there. James and Matthew, inseparable as they had been from birth, went into business together, opening a successful mercantile in town. All 4 children married well and gave Victoria and Bernard a house full of grandchildren to love and spoil. The ranch house expanded again to accommodate family gatherings, and holidays were raucous, joyful affairs with children running everywhere and love filling every corner. In the spring of 1900, Victoria and Bernard celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary. They were in their mid-40s now, weathered by sun and work and life, but still strong and healthy. They rode out to their special overlook as they did every anniversary, and stood together looking at the view they never tired of. 22 years, Bernard marveled. Sometimes it feels like we just met yesterday. Other times it feels like we have been together forever. Both of those things can be true, Victoria said, leaning into his warmth. Every day with you feels both brand new and completely natural. I never imagined I could be this happy, Bernard admitted. When I was younger, I thought happiness was something you achieved through success or wealth or accomplishment. But it is not any of those things. It is this: standing with the person you love, looking at a life you built together, knowing you made a difference. We did make a difference, Victoria said, to each other, to our children, to all the people we have helped over the years. We took something that started in cold and cruelty and turned it into warmth and love. That matters. She thought back to that desperate night in December 1878, standing on the porch of an abandoned building with snow falling and her future uncertain. She had been terrified and alone, abandoned by the people who should have protected her. But that night had led her here, to this man, to this life, to this love. I would not change anything, she said suddenly. If I could go back and prevent Thomas from dying or stop the Morgans from abandoning me, I do not think I would, because all of that pain and fear led me to you, and I would go through it all again if this was the result. Bernard pulled her close, his arms strong around her. I wish you had never had to suffer, but I'm grateful beyond measure that your path led you to me. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Victoria. You always will be. They kissed, tender and familiar, and then stood together watching as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the world in gold. Behind them, the ranch house glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming. Home. As the years continued, Victoria and Bernard aged together with grace and gratitude. They slowed down gradually, handing over more responsibilities to their children while still remaining active and involved in the ranch and the community. They took pleasure in simple things: morning coffee together, evening walks, time with their grandchildren, quiet conversations by the fire. In 1910, when Victoria was 55 and Bernard was 57, they were recognized by the Wyoming Territorial Historical Society for their contributions to the community and their charitable work. At the ceremony, Victoria was asked to speak about her experiences, and she told her story honestly: the loss, the abandonment, the fear, and the hope that had carried her through. I was left in the cold by people who should have cared for me, she said to the assembled crowd. But I was brought into the warmth by a stranger who saw my humanity and value when I could barely see it myself. Bernard Jameson gave me more than shelter that night. He gave me the chance to become the person I was meant to be, and together we built a life based on love, respect, and the belief that everyone deserves kindness and opportunity. That is the legacy I hope we leave. Not just a successful ranch or a charitable fund, but the knowledge that one act of decency can change everything. The audience gave her a standing ovation, and Bernard stood beside her with tears in his eyes, proud beyond words. They lived many more good years together, surrounded by family and love. They saw their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren arrive. They watched the West change and modernize, with railroads and telegraph lines and eventually automobiles replacing the horses and wagons they had known. But through all the changes, their love remained constant. They held hands on the porch swing in the evenings. They still rode out to their special overlook on anniversaries. They still looked at each other sometimes with wonder, amazed at what they had built together. On a warm spring morning in 1918, 40 years after they first met, Victoria and Bernard sat together on that same porch swing, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard. They were old now, in their 60s, but still healthy and alert and full of life. "Can you believe it has been 40 years?" Victoria asked, her hand in Bernard's. "Seems impossible," Bernard said, "but also inevitable, like we were always meant to find each other." "We were," Victoria said with certainty. "Everything that happened, all the pain and loss and fear, it was all leading us to each other. And it was worth it. Every moment was worth it for this." She gestured to the scene before them. The beautiful ranch house they had built and expanded over the decades, the prosperous land stretching in every direction, the family that filled their lives with joy and purpose, all of it had started with one act of kindness on a cold winter night. "I love you," Bernard said simply. "Today, tomorrow, and always?" "And I love you," Victoria replied. "Thank you for giving me a room in your house that night. Thank you for giving me a place in your heart. Thank you for giving me this life. Thank you for taking the chance, Bernard said, for trusting me when you had no reason to, for building this life with me." They sat together in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the sun climb higher in the sky and their family play before them. The story that had begun in abandonment and cold had transformed into one of love and warmth and lasting legacy. They had taken their pain and turned it into purpose, their fear into courage, their loneliness into connection. And on that spring morning, surrounded by everything they had built together, Victoria and Bernard Jameson were content. They had found each other against all odds, had loved each other through all challenges, and had created something beautiful and enduring that would last long after they were gone. The cowboy who had given a desperate woman shelter had received far more than he had given, and the woman who had been left in the cold had found the warmest home of all in his heart. Together they had proved that kindness matters, that love endures, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best things we will ever know. Their story was one of redemption and hope, of second chances and earned happiness, of a love that transformed two lonely people into a family that spanned generations. As the morning sun warmed their faces and their great-grandchildren's laughter filled the air, Victoria and Bernard knew that their story had turned out exactly as it was meant to. The cold had led them to warmth. The loneliness had led them to love. And the ending was not an ending at all, but rather the continuation of a legacy that would live on through everyone they had touched, everyone they had helped, and everyone who carried their love forward into the future. It was a good life, a life well lived. And it had all started with one simple act of human decency on a frozen Wyoming night 40 years before, when a cowboy had looked at a desperate woman and seen not a burden but a person who deserved help. That choice had changed everything, creating ripples that spread outward through time, touching countless lives and proving that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with compassion. Not with grand gestures, but with simple kindness freely given when it is needed most. And so their story continued, a testament to the transformative power of love, the importance of second chances, and the truth that home is not a place but the people who see you, value you, and choose you every single day. From that cold December night to this warm spring morning, From strangers to soulmates, from loneliness to legacy, Victoria and Bernard had found their happily ever after, not because life was easy, but because they had chosen each other and held on through everything that came. Their hands remained clasped as the day stretched before them, full of promise and peace, surrounded by the love they had created and the life they had built together.